Hey guys, tonight we're heading back, way back, to a place where sex wasn't just something whispered behind curtains. No, in ancient Babylon, it was regulated, litigated, and sometimes even divinely mandated. Imagine yourself under a dusty Mesopotamian sky, the scent of clay and crushed reeds in the air, and in your hand, a legal tablet that lists exactly what your marriage bed duties are. Romantic, right? The streets around you hum with life, traders hawking incense, scribes squinting at wet cuneiform, and somewhere, someone is being sued over a failed affair. You probably wouldn't survive this system for more than a week, especially if you're the type who forgets anniversaries. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere distant or exotic, or just your bedroom at 2:34 a.m., drop your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a Babylonian courtroom. It's not quite the marble drama of a modern legal thriller. No powdered wigs, no gavels, just clay tablets, a lot of sand, and maybe a goat or two. The judge is a local elder, possibly missing a few teeth, but not a speck of legal nuance. In front of him, a husband, a wife, and the accusation, failure to perform conjugal duties. Yes, really. See, Babylonian society, especially under King Hammurabi around 1754 BCE, took sex very seriously. The famed Code of Hammurabi wasn't just about theft or assault. It had several lines that spelled out what could go wrong in bed, and what to do when it did. Let's say you, a humble grain merchant, married the daughter of a well-to-do brewer. Your contract is clear. You owe her a roof, food, and, quite literally, conjugal attention. If you withhold affection, without cause, you could lose the house, the wife, and the goat. It's not just about love, it's about legal obligation. One particularly cheeky tablet now held in the Louvre recounts a case where a woman accused her husband of failure to approach her bed for 6 months. His defense? He'd been very busy with business. The judge ruled in her favor, noting that busy was not a recognized clause for avoiding intimacy. The man was fined and ordered to resume his bedroom duties or face full divorce. This wasn't an isolated case. Eleanor Herman in Sex with Kings reminds us that even in later centuries, sex was tied to governance. But Babylon wrote it in stone, or clay rather, and they enforced it. Historians still argue whether these laws were enforced regularly or simply existed as moral guidelines. Some believe they reflected the elite's ideals more than the commoner's reality. But the presence of so many tablets discussing these issues, that's hard to dismiss. And it wasn't just within marriage. Babylonian laws also dictated what kind of sex was legal and with whom. Homosexuality wasn't always criminalized, but it was categorized very precisely. If a man forced another into submission, it was a crime. But consensual relations, often left unmentioned. Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History suggests that Babylon had a more complex, layered view of sex than we give them credit for. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some temples, a legal scribe could serve as a witness during marriage consummations. Imagine lighting the candles, fluffing the hay-filled mattress, and inviting a dude with a stylus to take notes. Yes, Your Honor, the deed was indeed done, with enthusiasm. This level of regulation came from a belief that sex wasn't private. It affected the gods, the ancestors, the family reputation, and, most critically, the line of inheritance. If intimacy wasn't happening, it wasn't just a matter of affection. It was a problem for the future of land, names, and temples. There were even specific penalties for men who used a woman without contracting marriage. The key word there was use, as if the woman were property. And in many ways, legally, she was. This raises uncomfortable truths about power and consent in early civilizations. Though women had certain rights, they could own property, sue, and initiate divorce, they were still often seen as extensions of their husband's status. But Babylon wasn't heartless. Love poetry exists from this era too. Some of it is downright mushy. Lines like "Your scent is sweeter than honey on the wind," or "Let me be the fig leaf to your vine," hint that beyond the law books, passion still burned in reed-roofed bedrooms. Still, sex was never entirely free in Babylon. Every moan, whisper, or awkward silence had the potential to show up on a tablet. There's one surviving case where a woman was accused of excessive coquetry, essentially flirting too much with the neighbor's gardener. The punishment? Public shaming and a fine paid in barley. That gardener, by the way, mysteriously vanished from the records. One imagines he took his rake and moved to Assyria, so here you are in the heat of the court, your personal life inscribed forever in clay. No delete button. No, it was a phase, just hard law and harder pillows. You'd better make your bed wisely. Because in Babylon, sex isn't just personal, it's public policy. You wake up to the gentle murmur of reeds brushing against mud brick walls and the dry crackle of yesterday's clay tablet baking in the sun. A scribe nearby, barefoot, frowning, nose smudged with ink, etches a line that could make or break your next date night. Why? Because this isn't some abstract philosophy seminar. In Babylon, your sex life is a line item on a contract. Picture it. You're seated across from your bride-to-be in a modest courtyard, family members hovering awkwardly, and in between you both, beside a modest plate of figs, is a marriage contract so detailed it makes your rental agreement look like a napkin sketch. Babylonian marriage contracts were not shy. These weren't vague promises about love and devotion. These were explicit about everything from dowry lists to who gets the goat in a divorce, and yes, even how many times a week one should make an appearance in the marital bed. One particularly illuminating tablet, found near the ancient city of Sippar, spells it out. If the husband shall not lie with the wife for the span of 1 month and 1 cycle of the moon, and there be no sickness or travel to excuse him, then the wife may seek remedy from the elders. That's right. She could essentially file a complaint about sexual negligence. You'd think ancient contracts would dance around the subject. Nope. They waltzed right through it, the cuneiform equivalent of, "Dear sir, perform your duties or we're taking this to court." Historians still argue whether these clauses were commonly enforced or reserved for elite families protecting their lineage. But even if just a fraction of marriages were held to this standard, it paints a pretty unfiltered picture of how closely law and intimacy were braided together. Dowries were also more than a pile of bronze trinkets and ceremonial fabrics. They could include a built-in clause. In exchange for such goods, husband agrees to provide food, oil, cloth, shelter, and warmth of body. Warmth of body. Not metaphorical warmth, literal. You're not just vowing to love and cherish. You're agreeing to snuggle on demand. One curious example from the archives of Mari mentions a man who offered 3 sheep, 2 bolts of dyed cloth, and a tin mirror as dowry. In return, the bride's family demanded a twice-monthly visit to her chamber, specified regardless of season. Imagine being legally bound to romance someone during a sandstorm, romantic or respiratory hazard. Then there's the added spice of fertility pressure. If no children came from the marriage within a specified time, often 2 to 3 years, the contract permitted taking a concubine, with stipulations, of course. Any child from the concubine would still be subordinate to the child of the official wife if one ever arrived. You can almost picture the dinner conversations. "You haven't fulfilled Clause 3B, my dear. And you've clearly forgotten Addendum 4 about sandal removal etiquette." This wasn't just law, it was foreplay, with footnotes. Peter Webb, in The Erotic Spirit Through History, talks about how legal structures like these influence the emotional expectations of the couple. You didn't just hope for connection, you were held accountable for affection. In a way, it framed intimacy as an act of civic duty. A quirky side note, some contracts included a clause about excessive noise during conjugal activity. Apparently, your nighttime adventures could not disturb the neighbors. If they did, a fine was due, often in the form of grain, which makes one wonder just how thin those mud brick walls were, or how creative Babylonians got with pillows. Even the physical space of the marital bedroom was sometimes addressed. In wealthier homes, the contract outlined ownership of the mat and lamp, key romantic tools of the era. "She shall have sole use of the mat and lamp for 3 nights per cycle," one tablet reads. 3 nights. Cycle. You do the math. Now, from a modern perspective, this might feel uncomfortably transactional. But it's important to remember that in a world where survival depended on kinship networks, alliances, and legitimate heirs, the bed was not private, it was strategic. Still, love stories did bloom within the lines. A man named Nabu Bel Shumati was said to have refused a second wife despite pressure from both family and law. His contract included a clause allowing it, but he added a new one: I shall lie only with the wife of my choosing, and no other. Whether romantic or simply rebellious, it remains one of the earliest legal declarations of monogamous intent. Historians debate whether this was common or a peculiar one-off. Was Nabu Bel-Shumadi a hopeless romantic, or just really, really tired? And here's the kicker. These contracts weren't sealed with kisses. They were sealed with witnesses, wax seals, and the occasional chicken sacrifice, because nothing says, "Till death do us part," like poultry and parchment. So tonight, as you lie in your comfy bed with no scribes lurking by the dresser and no obligation to report to an elder if your partner snores, consider this. Your comfort was hard-won. It took centuries of awkward clay contracts, reed pen lawyers, and deeply unromantic romantic clauses to get here. And for Babylonians, sex wasn't just a passion. It was paperwork. You take a slow breath, inhaling the warm, incense-thick air of Babylon's temple district. It smells of crushed myrrh, sweat, and 1,000 whispered prayers. Bells tinkle softly from a high platform as women in linen robes drift like ghosts across polished stone. You're not at a wedding. You're not even in a courtroom. You're in a place where sex is a sacred act, and you, friend, are expected to take part. Welcome to the world of sacred intercourse, one of the most debated and mythologized features of ancient Mesopotamian religion. Often dubbed hieros gamos, or sacred marriage, this rite was far more than symbolic. According to several scholars, Babylonian temples, especially those dedicated to Inanna or Ishtar, depending on your linguistic loyalty, may have hosted ritualized sex acts intended to please the gods and ensure fertility for the land and people. The idea was simple in theory, but loaded in practice. A high priestess, representing the goddess, would unite with a king or designated man, acting as the shepherd of the people. Their union, observed or affirmed by a priestly council, was thought to renew the cycles of rain, grain, and divine favor, which, when you think about it, is a lot of pressure for a single night. But here's where things get sticky, metaphorically. Historians still argue whether this rite was widespread, symbolic, or, as Michel Foucault might suggest, a ceremonial performance of power disguised as pleasure. Some claim there's little concrete evidence of literal sex acts taking place. Others, like Peter Webb, argue that the abundance of poetry in temple records implies a tradition of sacred consummation far more physical than metaphorical. And then there's the story of Kubaba, a tavern keeper turned queen in Sumer, later mythologized as a temple priestess of unmatched influence. Legends imply she gained divine favor by offering herself in service to Inanna's rituals. Whether this means sexual rites or political savvy wrapped in religious devotion, well, we're still arguing about that at conferences. You wander deeper into the temple, sandals scuffing mosaic tiles depicting lions, palms, and intertwined human figures. The priestesses here are not what later history painted them to be. They're not courtesans. They are literate, trained, and, most importantly, legally autonomous. In some cases, they outrank male officials. That's right. The women in this sacred space aren't waiting for your approval. You're here on their terms. A particularly revealing and delightfully awkward Sumerian hymn describes the courtship of Dumuzi and Inanna in sensual, earthy language. Plow my vulva, man of my heart. Subtle? Not exactly, but poetic in its own pastoral way. Scholars like to point out that this hymn may have mirrored the temple rituals during New Year festivals. And while these rituals were sacred, they weren't private. That's the part modern listeners struggle with. Sex here was a community act. Not in the literal sense, thankfully, but in its societal implications. Your personal pleasure was linked to cosmic harmony. Your climax could bring rain, no pressure. In some temple contracts, there's evidence of women being pledged to sleep with the stranger, a custom that Foucault examined under the lens of societal control and structured desire. The idea was that a woman, once in her life, would wait at the temple gates until a man offered silver and requested her. Upon completion, the silver would be donated to the temple. The woman was considered blessed and, in some interpretations, now free to marry. Is this fact or just the garbled memory of early Greek tourists projecting their own fantasies? Historians still debate whether these acts were real or ritualized, literal or literary. What we do know is that the temples had records, painstakingly etched in clay of offerings, silver gifts, and names. One such record mentions a woman named Taramat who donated her silver of the gate to Inanna's temple. Was it payment for her service? Or merely poetic phrasing for a prayer well answered? It's one of those quiet mysteries we may never fully solve. A fringe detail that gets little spotlight? Temple prostitutes, if they existed in the legal sense, could own land. That's right. While being sexual intermediaries of the divine, they also managed vineyards, stored barley, and could sue debtors. Try fitting that into your typical romance novel. In Sex with Kings, Eleanor Herman explores how later royal courts mirrored this Babylonian blend of sex and state. Kings across time turned intimate relations into policy. But here, in this early age, it's the priestess, not the king, who seems to hold the upper hand. And you, awkward traveler in borrowed robes, are witnessing one of the earliest intersections of lust and law. By now, you've probably forgotten you were tired. Or maybe not. Maybe your brain is floating on the rhythm of temple bells and that lingering scent of oil and crushed rosewood. You settle onto a low cushion near the sacred pool, where whispers echo off walls painted with scenes of divine coupling. A scribe passes you, humming an old temple hymn, maybe about rain or harvest or a particularly effective lovemaking technique. It's hard to tell. Ancient Sumerian is a subtle beast. And while much of this world has turned to dust, one thing lingers, the undeniable truth that for early Babylonians, sex wasn't a secret. It was sacred, it was sung, and sometimes it was signed in triplicate. You sit in the still heat of a Babylonian afternoon, a thin sheen of sweat forming beneath your linen collar. Somewhere, a date vendor shouts over a bleeding goat. But the real drama? It's happening a few alleys over, in the magistrate's shaded courtyard, where a woman has just accused her husband of adultery, and not the subtle kind. In Babylon, adultery wasn't just a moral failing. It was a full-on criminal offense. And depending on who you were, or more importantly, what gender you were, the consequences could range from a polite fine to a very public, very wet execution. Let's talk about that river. The Code of Hammurabi had specific punishments for cheating spouses. And spoiler, they weren't handing out couples therapy vouchers. If a married woman was caught in the act with a man who was not her husband, both parties were to be bound and thrown into the river. That's right. Zero poetic metaphors. Just splash. Now, there was a lifeline. Literally. If the woman's husband forgave her, both she and her partner in passion could be spared, which gave talk it out like adults a whole new sense of urgency. But before we crown Hammurabi the king of harsh breakups, let's examine the nuance. The law also offered a fascinating loophole. If the woman wasn't caught in the act but only accused, she could swear her innocence and undergo the ordeal by water. That meant standing waist deep in a river while reciting an oath to the gods. If the river accepted her, she was innocent. If she drowned, well, not exactly helpful for appeal. Historians still argue whether the ordeal was metaphorical or literal. Some suggest it may have involved a ritual bath. Others argue it was a very real dunk tank of death. Either way, your ability to tread water could be the difference between gossip and a gravestone. Men, as you might expect, played by slightly different rules. A married man caught sleeping with another woman? If she was unmarried, he might get away with a fine. If she was married, things got dicier, but usually only if her husband made a stink about it. Patriarchy, thy name is Mesopotamia. Still, Babylon wasn't entirely heartless. There are records of cases where women successfully defended themselves by proving they'd been abandoned, mistreated, or outright ignored. One famous tablet describes a woman named Ninsun who brought forward witnesses to testify that her husband hadn't spoken to her or shared the mat in over a year. Her accusation? He took up with a temple baker. The court ruled in her favor and granted her not only freedom but the entire dowry back. That temple baker, by the way, is never mentioned again, possibly relocated, or baking more quietly. Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings reminds us that even centuries later, adultery in royal circles was both a scandal and a strategy. But in Babylon, it was more bluntly transactional. Marital faithfulness wasn't about personal emotion, it was about legal inheritance, social stability, and maintaining divine order. You weren't just betraying your spouse, you were endangering the city's cosmic balance. No pressure. Let's not forget the fringe cases, though. There's one curious story about a man who accused his wife of adultery only for her to counter-accuse him of sorcery via neglect. Apparently, he'd been spending so much time away from home that she believed he'd cursed her fertility. The judges, who may or may not have rolled their eyes, dismissed both charges. The couple was sent home with a warning and, oddly enough, a new goat. Peter Webb notes that in many of these cases, punishment depended less on the law itself and more on the testimony presented. This is where things got theatrical. Witnesses were bribed, tablets were misremembered, and occasionally a scribe would suddenly develop amnesia about what he copied last week. The law may have been etched in stone, but memory? That was soft clay. Still, it's worth noting that even in a system this rigid, the people found ways to maneuver. Legal divorce was permitted, sometimes even encouraged, if the marriage had broken down. And while adultery was a punishable offense, it could also be a way out. A sort of final performance, complete with legal fallout and audience. A quirky tidbit. In some cases, a cheating spouse could substitute a slave or servant to face punishment. That's right, early scapegoating, Mesopotamian edition. It didn't always work, but it happened often enough to appear in legal debates. One tablet details how a man claimed it was his personal steward who had lain with the neighbor's wife, not him. The steward, notably, had already fled. You can imagine the judge. Sir, your defense is that someone else wore your sandals, crept into a house, and seduced a married woman while you were asleep next door? Long pause. The fine was doubled. By now, you're beginning to realize Babylon's legal system was less about cold justice and more about careful storytelling. Who could tell the most believable lie? Who had the most polished witnesses? Who could cry on cue while quoting temple scripture? And here's the strangest part. Adultery wasn't always shameful. In some love poems and songs, secret lovers are romanticized, even honored. Desire, after all, doesn't always respect borders, even clay ones. So here you are, sitting in the shadow of a fig tree, sipping date beer and watching a couple bicker outside the courtroom. She's brandishing a clay tablet. He's sweating through his tunic. The elders look bored, and you're suddenly very grateful your worst breakup didn't involve a mandatory swim test. You wander through a narrow alley beside a Babylonian bakery, flour floating in golden clouds, the scent of sesame and cardamom almost convincing you the past isn't so bad. But just around the corner, someone's arguing loudly under a fig tree. It's a husband and wife again, because tonight, you've landed in the middle of yet another legal mess involving marriage, intimacy, and this time, divorce. But not just any divorce. This one's about sex. In Babylon, getting married was complicated, but getting divorced, that was its own bureaucratic fever dream, especially when sex, or the lack thereof, was involved. Let's say you and your spouse just stopped connecting. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was the barley taxes. Maybe your partner insisted on quoting temple hymns mid-cuddle. Whatever the cause, the intimacy faded. In modern times, you'd maybe try couples counseling. In Babylon, you'd take it to the elders and present your argument with receipts, witnesses, and possibly a rooster. The Code of Hammurabi laid out several reasons a spouse could seek divorce, and neglecting conjugal obligations was high on the list. According to Law 142, if a woman hated her husband and declared, "You shall not have me," she could leave him, provided there was no wrongdoing on his part. But if she failed in her duties, including sexual ones, she could be thrown out with no compensation. Balance of power, it seems, came with terms and conditions. Now, imagine this scenario. Your partner hasn't approached you in months. There's no illness, no war campaign, no temple retreat, just a chronic case of "I'm tired." You go before the judge, and with all the grace you can muster, declare that the union is now just cohabitation with a ghost. One real-life case, preserved in a tablet from the city of Uruk, involved a woman named Beltia, who argued her husband had not fulfilled his conjugal promise for 3 moon cycles and 3 nights. The phrase was so common, it became almost poetic. The husband's rebuttal? She sleeps with her back to me and refuses the lamp. A line so vague, scholars still argue whether it refers to mood lighting or something metaphorical. The judge, bless his patience, ruled in favor of Beltia. She was granted divorce, partial dowry return, and, perhaps most satisfying, a public declaration that she had fulfilled her womanly station. We don't know what happened to her ex, but we hope he at least kept the lamp. A particularly juicy example from Sex with Kings involves a parallel later on, royalty using similar bedroom-based arguments to get rid of inconvenient spouses. Eleanor Herman points out that Louis XVI's inability to consummate his marriage with Marie Antoinette for years became a matter of state concern. If only he'd been born a few thousand years earlier, Babylon would have had just the tablet for him. Still, Babylon wasn't only about punishment. If both parties agreed that the marriage was without affection, they could dissolve it amicably. There's even a charming example from Nippur where a couple, Ahu and Kulam, divorced because they no longer found pleasure in shared bread. That's cuneiform for the spark is gone. Fringe tidbit, some contracts included a marital probation clause. If the marriage wasn't working after a set period, usually 1 year, it could be ended without penalty. That's right, Babylon invented the trial marriage. Swipe right for a 12-month test period, guaranteed by goat collateral. But before you get too starry-eyed about ancient progressive policy, remember that power imbalances still loomed large. Women could seek divorce, but only if they could prove misconduct, neglect, or failure of bedroom duties. Men, on the other hand, could simply declare dissatisfaction and send their wives away, unless the wife's father had secured a particularly airtight contract. And yes, sometimes those contracts were tighter than a papyrus scroll in a monsoon. One agreement read, should he cast her out without cause, he shall pay her weight in silver and return all her father's livestock. Motivation, if nothing else, to keep the fires burning. Peter Webb highlights the emotional tightrope people walked. Sex was not simply personal. It was a matter of public order, economic balance, and divine approval. Even Foucault's later writings nod to how legal frameworks shaped and restricted desire. In Babylon, this was law you could trip over barefoot. There's also the peculiar practice of temporary divorce. If a man left on a long journey and his wife remained alone for more than a year without word, she could legally take another partner. But should the husband return? Awkward. Babylonian law required the woman to choose. She could stay with the new man, but had to return the original dowry. Or she could take the old husband back and hope he'd unpack the camel bags without resentment. This led to some painfully bureaucratic love triangles. One tablet reads, I, Enlil-Bani, returned after the counting of the moons. My wife had taken another. She chose him. I took the barley and left. Simple, sad, extremely Babylonian. By now, you've probably formed a deep respect for just how structured ancient love was. There was no ghosting. No, we're on a break. Everything required paperwork, even passion. So you stroll past the courthouse as another couple steps forward, their clay tablets clutched like shields. One side accuses, the other defends. The scribe yawns. The judge scratches his beard. And the audience, because there always is one, leans in for the verdict. And you? You quietly vow to be kinder to your partner next time you argue about whose turn it is to blow out the candle. The sun dips lower behind the ziggurat silhouette, casting long shadows that stretch across the worn stone alleys of Babylon. You follow the faint sounds of muttered prayers and the clack of wooden sandals toward a narrow structure marked with a symbol, half moon, reed stylus, and a suspiciously shy-looking sheep. You've arrived at a place few talk about comfortably, even here, the virginity inspection room. Yes, that was a thing. It wasn't always official. Sometimes it was private. But when it came to legal matters like marriage, dowries, and especially annulments, virginity wasn't just a concept. It was a status, a financial guarantee, a legally relevant body part. And verifying it? That, unfortunately, was a process. Imagine you're a young bride-to-be in Babylon, and your family has arranged a politically useful marriage with a nice enough grain merchant. The wedding takes place, the guests cheer, the lamps flicker out. Then in the morning, the family demands proof. Not feelings, not poems, a sheet. If that sheet is stained, congratulations. Your dowry is safe, your marriage is valid, and your mother-in-law is already planning grandchildren. But if not, well, that's when things start to get ugly. There are court tablets that detail these disputes, usually filed under dowry litigation. One well-preserved tablet from Sippar describes a groom who returned his bride the very next day, accusing her of deception. The bride's family insisted she was untouched, and demanded a tribunal. Witnesses were called. A midwife was brought in. The court determined, using language we won't repeat, that the man's accusation was without solid sign and ruled in the bride's favor. Historians still argue how common these inspections were, or whether they became ritualized more than practical. Some scholars believe that in wealthier homes, a family midwife quietly handled the confirmation. Others suggest the involvement of temple witnesses, especially if the marriage had political or property stakes. But perhaps most unsettling is how this process, designed to safeguard a woman's reputation, often backfired. If no proof could be presented, the consequences could be devastating: annulment, public shame, dowry forfeiture, or worse, punishment under the claim of fraud. Peter Webb, in his exploration of sexual customs, notes that in Babylon, virginity was less about personal history and more about economic trust. It was symbolic currency, sealed in blood, or assumed to be. One fringe story tells of a young bride whose husband, unable to prove her non-virginity, instead accused her of sleeping like a man. The meaning is still debated. It could imply she snored or that she didn't perform submissively enough. The judges, perhaps as confused as we are, dismissed the case with a fine for unwarranted poetic license. There were, of course, those who found ways around the problem. Some mothers reportedly prepared special herbal tinctures that mimicked bloodstains, an ancient theatrical trick involving sheep's wool and pomegranate juice. Others bribed witnesses or simply hosted smaller weddings to avoid scrutiny, but the stakes remained high. In one famous case preserved in the Ashmolean Museum, a woman was divorced and exiled after her husband claimed she was not a virgin, as she declared. The contract had included a virginity clause. Her father sued. The court ruled in favor of the husband. The woman's dowry was split, half returned to her father, half kept by the husband as wasted grain. Even Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings references how similar virginity dramas played out in later courts, particularly with queens-to-be. Catherine of Aragon, anyone? But here in Babylon, there were no royal annulments, just clay, claims, and whispered prayers. There's a strange sort of irony, though. For all this obsession with premarital purity, Babylon was also home to temple rites where women engaged in sacred intercourse. The contradiction is jarring, but also deeply human. One part of society punished what another celebrated. So as you stand near the inspection room, a modest side chamber with worn cushions and oil lamps, you can't help but think of the thousands of women who sat here before you, nervous, silent, maybe terrified. And you begin to see how the law, for all its supposed fairness, often landed harder on those least able to defend themselves. It's enough to make you want to toss the tablets and elope with a Sumerian sculptor. But this was Babylon. The law was the law, and virginity, that was a matter of public record. By now, the inspection room lies quiet again. The oil has burned low. The reed curtain sways gently, letting in the scent of jasmine and the distant murmur of temple flutes. Someone down the alley is humming a love song, soft, slightly off-key, and hauntingly beautiful. And you? You're thinking about all the things in your life that don't require notarization, scrutiny, or tribunal panels. Like holding hands, like shared glances, like the quiet, invisible trust built in moments that no tablet could record. Sleep comes slowly, but with it, a quiet knowing. The past was strange, complicated, often cruel. But understanding it helps us appreciate the soft places where history no longer touches. The streets grow quieter now, the last vendors closing shop, and temple fires beginning to glow, orange and thick with resin smoke. You're walking through the noble quarter of Babylon, a place of tiled courtyards, carved columns, and the occasional melodramatic flute solo drifting from a window. It's here that you come across a story far older than any romantic comedy. Concubines. Yes, the word has a certain dusty glamour to it. Silk robes, candlelight, long sighs near the fountain. But in Babylon, concubinage wasn't just a romantic sidebar. It was a legal institution, baked into contracts and often, surprisingly, quite progressive. Kind of. Let's say you're a well-to-do merchant. You've married the daughter of a priest, but after years of polite dinners and airless nights, the pressure to produce offspring mounts. Your wife, intelligent and sensible, agrees. The family line must go on. So, she proposes that you bring in a concubine, specifically one she chooses. And just like that, a new clause is added to the marriage contract. The concubine, usually a servant or distant cousin, is formally listed as auxiliary womb, not the actual term, but emotionally accurate. She's housed, clothed, and her children, if any, become part of the legal family structure. The surprising bit? The wife often retained authority over the concubine. That's right, she could set the rules. One contract from the city of Kish includes the line, "She shall not sit at the high table, nor speak when not addressed, save by my lady's leave." It reads more like office etiquette than a torrid triangle. Peter Webb points out that this arrangement, while certainly unequal, gave women agency over how their husbands fulfilled their fertility obligations. Rather than being replaced, the wife became the administrator of reproductive expansion. Who says romance is dead? But here's where it gets sticky. Legally, concubines had fewer rights. If the husband died without a clear will, the concubine could be cast out unless she bore a son. Sons changed everything. A male child gave the concubine bargaining power, inheritance, and in some cases, control of property. Daughters, less so. One fringe case tells of a concubine named Taputu, whose son was overlooked in a will. She marched into the court, holding the child, who was apparently crying very dramatically, and demanded recognition. The elders reviewed her contract, noted the clause about should she bear fruit, it is his, and ruled in her favor. Taputu received land, 6 goats, and, most impressively, her own reed house, separate from the main estate. A minor victory, but a legal precedent nonetheless. Historians still argue whether concubinage was considered shameful or simply strategic. Some see it as a mark of wealth, others as a symptom of patriarchal pressure. But the tablets make one thing clear. It was common, and often complicated. The concubine's status hovered somewhere between family member and employee. She could not initiate divorce, but she could sue for abuse. She could not inherit property directly, but her children could. And in some households, if the main wife died, the concubine was promoted. A sort of unofficial succession ladder, from side room to main chamber, with improved cushions and a view of the courtyard. And not all concubines were passive figures in this drama. In one deliciously detailed case from Babylon proper, a concubine named Emeshlunu was accused of poisoning the wife's pomegranate wine. No one died, but the wife did vomit dramatically during dinner. A court inquiry followed. The judge, who was either deeply cynical or just hungry, ruled it was food poisoning, likely from fish sauce gone sour. Emeshlunu walked free. The wife reportedly moved in with her sister. Then there's the story Eleanor Herman tells about concubines in later courts, particularly those who became queen mothers. Royal concubines, once dismissed as side characters, often became political powerhouses when their sons inherited the throne. Babylon, it seems, planted the seed for that dynamic. Still, it wasn't always palace drama. Many concubines lived quiet lives, cooking, raising children, and occasionally negotiating with their primary household for better olive oil. Their lives were regulated by contracts, but filled with human complexity, jealousy, companionship, late-night stories told to wide-eyed children with uncertain futures. And what of love? Did it ever bloom between concubine and husband? Rarely recorded, but it must have happened. The tablets don't capture whispers in the dark, or the way someone smiled across a crowded feast. But one poem, likely composed by a concubine, survives. "Though I am not first in your house, let me be first in your heart." It's not Shakespeare, but it lingers. So here you are, reclining on a woven mat beneath a fig tree, listening to the wind rustle through palm fronds. Somewhere, a concubine tucks her child into bed, while the household sleeps around her, oblivious. Her place in the world is complicated, legally, socially, emotionally, but it's carved into clay, preserved, and maybe in that permanence, there's something like justice. The moon rises higher, casting a soft silver sheen over the rooftops of Babylon, turning even the chipped mud brick walls into something that almost looks elegant. You find yourself trailing behind a tall, stooped man in a reed hat, his arms full of tablets, his voice muttering about betrayal, scandal, and the unfairness of canceled engagements. Welcome to one of Babylon's most common, most dramatic, and most legally tangled events, the breach of promise. In short, ancient ghosting, except with lawyers. Let's say you've promised to marry the baker's daughter. There's been a formal engagement, a shared meal between families, maybe even an exchange of gifts, bracelets, beer, a clay mirror or two. Then, 1 week before the wedding, you change your mind. Perhaps you realize you're in love with the daughter of a wine merchant. Or maybe, let's be honest, you just panicked. Whatever the reason, the bride's father takes you to court. In Babylon, an engagement was not just a hopeful arrangement. It was a legally binding contract. Breaking it without cause was considered loss of reputation and economic injury, not just to the jilted party, but to their entire family. It implied deception, dishonor, and worst of all, wasted catering deposits. The penalty depends on the specifics of the contract. Some included a clause: should either party withdraw without just cause, they shall repay twice the value of the pledged gifts. Which meant you might find yourself handing back more than the anklet, possibly a donkey. One actual court record tells of a man named Elam Shuma, who broke off an engagement with a woman named Ninbada, claiming her voice was too shrill. The judges, apparently unimpressed by his excuse, ruled against him. He had to return the gifts and compensate Ninbada's family with 5 minas of silver. Adjusted for inflation, enough to buy a small orchard. Ninbada, we hope, went on to marry someone with better taste in voices. Fringe detail? In certain high-profile cases, engagement contracts were sealed in the temple, with witnesses from the clergy. This elevated the contract to near-divine status. Breaking it wasn't just a social blunder, it was seen as an affront to the gods. This raises an interesting scholarly debate. Was romantic commitment in Babylon more spiritual or transactional? Some argue the temple setting implied that love and law were intertwined. Others point out that half of these contracts list nothing more romantic than livestock counts. Peter Webb suggests Babylonian commitment rituals were deeply performative, less about emotion, more about demonstrating honor, wealth, and public accountability. Still, not every breakup was one-sided. Sometimes the bride or her family backed out. In those cases, similar penalties applied. Though if the groom had a powerful family, the consequences were often negotiated. One scribe wrote, "The bridegroom demanded the necklace be returned. The father offered barley instead. The matter was resolved over 2 jugs of date wine." You can practically smell the awkward family dinner. Then there were the wild cards, cases where the groom tried to pretend no engagement had occurred. One notorious case involves a merchant named Etopiah Shur, who swore under oath that he had never promised to marry the weaver's daughter. The weaver, however, had witnesses, 3 of them, all eager to testify in excruciating detail about the promise made during the spring festival, involving too much beer and some very flowery declarations. The court ruled against him. And adding insult to injury, his name was recorded publicly on a tablet titled "False Speaker in Matters of Union," the Babylonian version of being roasted on a community message board. Eleanor Herman would probably agree. This sounds a lot like later royal scandals, where political engagements were made and broken for strategic gain. In those courts, however, broken engagements meant war. In Babylon, they meant barley fines and lifelong side-eye at the market. Sometimes, however, the law had a heart. A few rare cases mention couples who mutually agreed to part ways, citing incompatibility, illness, or persistent disagreement about goat placement. In these cases, if both sides returned the gifts and no formal contract had been sealed, no penalty was issued. They were advised to part quietly and, if possible, not to slander each other at the public baths. Quirky tidbit: one engagement agreement required the groom to compose a poem for the bride. Not optional. Failure to do so meant a loss of face and, yes, a monetary fine. A surviving fragment reads, "You are the cool wind over wheat fields, the lamp that burns even when the oil runs low. Your teeth are like pebbles in the river." It trails off there. We'll give him a B+ for effort. So you sit now under a cypress tree, listening to the gentle bickering of a young couple nearby. She's scolding him for being late. He's mumbling something about forgetting the bride price due date. Their friends laugh. A scribe rolls his eyes and prepares another tablet, just in case. And you? You sip your date wine and think, maybe love has always been complicated. But at least today, nobody gets fined for forgetting to write a poem. You wake to the soft patter of sandals on sun-baked stone, a low hum of conversation drifting from a shaded pavilion near the edge of Babylon's bustling market square. This part of town feels different. Less silk and sandals, more sweat and silver. You're in the artisan quarter now, where merchants argue over copper weights and fish sellers chant morning prices like poetry. But tucked between the coppersmith and the date vendor sits a small, almost unimpressive structure, low walls, faded paint, and a carved tablet above the door featuring a woman holding a jar and a stylus. You've just found one of Babylon's most misunderstood and legally fascinating spaces, the registered house of a sex worker. Forget everything you thought you knew. In Babylon, sex work wasn't just tolerated, it was, in many cases, professionalized and taxed, and sometimes protected by law. Now, it's important to understand that the term prostitute in ancient Mesopotamia covered a wide spectrum. From sacred temple workers to casual, unaffiliated individuals, the line between religious right, public service, and personal autonomy was blurred by law, culture, and economy. Some women worked under temple patronage. These so-called Ndita women weren't exactly sex workers in the modern sense, but some did engage in sacred rites involving sexual acts. Others, especially in urban centers like Babylon, worked independently. And here's where it gets spicy. They could sue for unpaid services. Yes, you heard that right. A woman named Gula Shiriktu once brought a case before the city elders claiming that a high-ranking scribe did enjoy her company for the duration of 3 nights and did not provide the agreed silver. The judges reviewed witness statements. You have to wonder what those sounded like, and ruled in her favor. The man was fined triple the agreed amount for deceit against a lawful woman of trade. Peter Webb highlights how Babylonian sex workers operated in a quasi-legal gray zone. They weren't part of respectable family structures, but they could own property, register complaints, and pay taxes. Some even formed associations, proto-unions if you will. One recovered document lists names of women in service, each paying a monthly fee toward a shared emergency fund, how likely managed by a temple accountant. And that's not even the most interesting part. The legal status of these women was often higher than that of household servants. They could refuse clients. They could keep their earnings. And, this is important, they could not be claimed or married off without consent. A law from Hammurabi's code specifies if a man takes a woman of the street to wife, and she agrees, then she is wife. Else, she remains free. In other words, no forced marriages. Consent required. Historians still argue about the moral framing. Were these women empowered agents or desperate figures navigating the only path available? Foucault would likely point to the way social structures dictated which kinds of sexuality were acceptable and which were commodified. But Babylon didn't leave this to abstract theory. They wrote it down. In clay. A particularly revealing legal tablet tells the story of a woman named Nindar. She had worked independently for 10 years, living in a small reed house near the Ishtar Gate. She left a will. In it, she bequeathed her savings, a tidy pile of silver rings, and a small garden to her niece, along with the instruction, "Let her not be ashamed of the work that bore this." It's one of the few surviving texts where a sex worker is not only named, but honored. And then there are the fringe oddities. Some temples issued permits or tokens, small clay discs marked with symbols, believed by scholars to be early entry vouchers for ritual services. Others suggest they served as payment receipts, offering legal protection in case a client denied visiting. Imagine holding your ancient punch card, good for 5 visits and a free incense stick. And while we're at it, fun fact, the first known sex workers' tax appears in a tablet from the reign of Nabonidus. The women of a particular district were required to give 1/10 of their earnings to the temple of Marduk. Not unlike tithing, just with more paperwork and probably fewer awkward sermons. One document kept in the British Museum even outlines a complaint filed by a keeper of house against a city guard for harassment. The ruling? The guard was fined for inappropriate behavior toward women under legal protection, which is a fancy Babylonian way of saying, you messed with the wrong girls. Of course, the system wasn't perfect. There were still exploitative scenarios. Young girls sold into the profession to pay off family debts, women abandoned by lovers or husbands who then turned to sex work for survival. The law tried to distinguish between voluntary and coerced workers, but enforcement? Let's just say clay tablets don't always reflect the full story. And yet, despite the challenges, the records show that Babylonian sex workers carved out spaces of surprising autonomy. They weren't hidden. They weren't universally scorned. In some ways, they were the most publicly documented women of the ancient world. So here you are now, seated outside that modest house as night descends. You watch a woman sweep her doorstep clean, light a lamp, and straighten a modest painted jar of coal. Her eyes meet yours briefly, calm, unreadable, and she disappears behind the curtain. No shame, no fear, just routine. Because for her, this isn't scandal, it's livelihood. It's paperwork, it's Babylon. And somewhere down the street, a scribe yawns and makes another note in his waxy tablet. Tomorrow, another case might come, another dispute, another name etched in clay, another voice that somehow managed to survive 3,000 years of dust and silence. The stars shimmer above Babylon tonight, flickering softly like oil lamps in the sky, and the breeze finally shifts, bringing relief from the heat, and with it, the scent of river mud, frankincense, and warm grain. You walk through the palace district now, where the buildings are larger, the doors thicker, and the secrets, well, deeper. Inside one of these grand homes, tucked behind woven curtains and polished cedar doors, lies a bedroom that hasn't echoed with laughter or anything else for a long time. Royal silence, not from political scandal, not from disease, but from an absence far more awkward. No intimacy. And in Babylon, this kind of quiet wasn't just noticed, it became a national concern. Tonight's story is about what happened when fertility, sexual, political, and spiritual failed to perform on cue. A story of pressure, law, and legacy. When the bedroom turned into a courtroom. Let's say you're a queen. You've been married for 3 years. The ceremonial tablets are filed, the scribes are bored, and the court astrologer has already predicted great fortune. Once you produce an heir. But your belly remains stubbornly flat, and your mother-in-law has started whispering about adopting a cousin's child. You are not amused. In Babylon, infertility wasn't just a private sorrow. It was a legal complication, a social disruption, and depending on who you asked, a spiritual failing. And since nobody knew much about internal medicine, the blame could go either way. Enter the court. Babylonian law allowed for marriage contracts to include fertility clauses. One famous example from the city of Ur spells it out. If in 3 years she bears no child, he may take a secondary wife. Should he refuse, he forfeits his right to inheritance. That's right. Even refusing to take another wife was punishable, because it meant the family line was at risk. Historians still argue whether the pressure fell more heavily on women or men. Most of the written cases focus on women being replaced or supplemented. But tucked in between the lines, we find a few rebellious tablets, like the case of a man named Shumaiah, whose wife Ninsuman dragged him to court after 3 years of no fruit. She claimed he was averse to physical congress and unwilling to make offerings to the goddess of birth. The court ruled against him. He was ordered to take spiritual counsel and try again with intention. It's the Mesopotamian version of maybe light some candles next time. And what if the problem wasn't obvious? That's where the healers came in, both legitimate and wildly imaginative. Babylonian fertility specialists prescribed everything from crocodile dung compresses, yes, you read that right, to chanting hymns while massaging the feet. One surviving tablet suggests a diet of honey, goat liver, and blessed river water poured down the back. Romantic. But if that didn't work, the legal process could be swift and brutal. A childless marriage could be annulled, or converted into a polygamous one. The wife might be sent back to her father's house, sometimes with her dowry intact, sometimes not. A fringe contract from Sippar even included a backup plan. Should she be barren, she shall become temple sister and live apart, receiving barley for upkeep. A kind of early retirement, courtesy of your own reproductive system. And yet, not all hope was lost. There were adoption clauses too. One clever couple, both in their 40s, an age that in Babylon was considered practically post-apocalyptic, adopted a young servant's child. The contract made it clear, he shall be known as son and no less. The child was raised as heir, the wife maintained her position, and the scandal was avoided. Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings explores how royal dynasties in later centuries bent laws to justify similar arrangements. Think of Henry VIII's obsession with sons, or Catherine de Medici's reliance on fertility potions. Babylon had already done it all, just with more reed paper and fewer public beheadings. But let's not romanticize it. For most women, the stakes were high. Their identity, legal and personal, was often tied to childbearing. If they couldn't produce an heir, their entire status could dissolve. Some were sent to serve in temples, others were replaced by younger wives or concubines, and a few, like a woman named Lilitu, chose their own fate. Lilitu, recorded in a legal tablet from Nippur, was married at age 14. After 5 years without a child, her husband prepared to annul the contract, but Lilitu preempted him, filing her own claim for separation on grounds of neglect, cruelty, and excessive offerings to the gods. A bold move. The court, perhaps impressed by her initiative, granted her a portion of the estate and permission to live independently, an extremely rare ruling. Peter Webb points out that cases like Lilitu's were exceptions. Most followed the expected path. If no child came, the household restructured itself. New partners arrived. Old ones faded into the background. The bedroom door closed, quietly, finally. And yet, these silent rooms remain some of the most eloquent testimonies of Babylonian law. They remind us that intimacy wasn't just a private act. It was politics. It was survival. And when it failed, it could reshape everything. So here you sit by the edge of a lily pond in the palace courtyard, listening to frogs croak in the reeds and the quiet drip of water from a carved lion spout. Somewhere behind you, a woman lights a lamp and places it beside an empty crib. Not all stories end with heirs and happy endings, but some leave behind clay echoes strong enough to carry forward 3,000 years. The evening deepens as you walk through a narrow passage lined with flickering lamps, their flames fluttering behind colored glass like sleepy moths. You turn a corner and find yourself inside a quiet chamber, its walls polished with soot-darkened stone, and in the middle, a pair of low couches beside a thick reed mat. A clay shelf displays household items, a jug of oil, a bowl of fruit, and, curiously, a carved wooden bedpost adorned with symbols. No, this isn't just a bedroom, it's where oaths are sworn. In Babylon, if you wanted to make your word count, you didn't just raise your hand or place it on a scroll. You might swear upon a god, a grain harvest, or, oddly enough, your bed, yes, your actual bed, or more specifically, what happened on it. Among the more delightful quirks of Babylonian legal custom was the tendency to anchor testimony in intimate or domestic contexts. While temples remained the supreme spaces for formal oaths, when it came to matters of marriage, fidelity, or even inheritance, the bed, humble though it may seem, was considered a valid altar of truth. You're likely wondering, is this literal? Historians still debate the exact mechanics. Did someone physically place their hand on the mattress and solemnly declare their truth? Or was it a symbolic gesture? Some tablets suggest both. One surviving example reads, "By the mat and lamp, I swear I have taken no other woman," which certainly feels like the Mesopotamian version of "on my life and my love seat." It's charming, almost romantic, until you realize these oaths were often used in tense legal disputes. In one case, a man named Ibn Adad was accused of secretly marrying a second wife while traveling in Dilbat. Upon returning home, he swore, before the elders and his first wife, that he had laid with no woman but his own, and that upon the very mat she now washes. Poetry? No. But it worked. The court dismissed the charges, and the first wife, reportedly unimpressed, demanded a new mat. And while most of these oaths happened within the privacy of the home, others were carried out in public. During legal hearings, parties could request to affirm on the symbols of the house, which included lamps, mats, and bedposts. Imagine a courtroom where someone rolls in their headboard as Exhibit A. Peter Webb notes that household oaths provided a more personal, tactile connection to legal promises, especially in matters of sex and domestic relations. You weren't just swearing on something abstract. You were invoking the objects that had borne witness to your most private moments. And sometimes the bed itself was on trial. One fringe legal record from Borsippa includes a dispute over ownership of a sacred bed inherited from a temple singer. Two of her lovers claimed it had been promised to them. The judge, surely exhausted by this point, ruled that the bed should remain in the temple, as no man may claim the mat of Marduk. A divine mattress ruling, if you will. There's also an account from Sippar where a woman accused her husband of lying about a former mistress. She demanded he swear before the gods and the frame that bore us. He refused. The court took this as partial guilt and ordered him to pay restitution. Not to the wife, curiously, but to her father, possibly for emotional damages, possibly for furniture. This emphasis on domestic objects wasn't just symbolic, it reflected how deeply intertwined sex, trust, and legal identity were in Babylonian life. Your bed wasn't just where you slept, it was your stage, your shrine, your filing cabinet of vows. Eleanor Herman, writing about royal lovers, discusses how physical spaces took on spiritual and political significance. In Babylon, this principle extended all the way down to your bedroom rug. By invoking the lamp and the mat, you called upon the domestic divine, those everyday gods who watched in silence as promises were made, broken, and sometimes cleverly renegotiated. One poetic fragment, probably meant for recitation during a marriage ceremony, reads, "Let the mat know truth, the lamp shine on honesty, and the post remember joy." It's clunky in translation, but beautifully mundane. There's something strangely reassuring about this, isn't there? That love, when serious enough, could be measured by the items that surrounded it. That even in a world of harsh laws and severe punishments, there was still room for rituals involving pillows and lamps. But of course, not all oaths were honest. A scandalous case tells of a woman who swore she had remained faithful by the 3 lamps and the hanging cords, only to later be seen sneaking into a wine merchant's home after dark. She was fined, not for the affair, but for oath-breaking, which was considered more legally damaging than the act itself. The court noted, somewhat poetically, "The lamp does not lie, even if the lips do." Historians still argue about how often these oaths were actually enforced. Were they formal requirements, or just ritual gestures? Were they admissible in larger court disputes or reserved for domestic matters? Some believe they served as psychological tools, ways of binding people emotionally to truth without needing physical evidence. Others think they were practical. The lamp saw what the judge could not. So here you are, reclining beside a worn-out mat in a lamp that's flickered through 100 whispered promises. The air smells faintly of oil and clay. The silence is thick, not with fear, but with memory. And maybe, just maybe, the old Babylonians were onto something. Maybe truth isn't always about scrolls and statues. Sometimes it lives in the things we touch every night. A frayed sheet, a dented lamp, a smooth wooden post that somehow remembers everything. You step out into the cool of the courtyard, past a group of young scribes arguing over the correct number of barley measures in a dowry claim. The lamps flicker in the breeze now, casting shadows that leap like tiny dancers across the mud brick walls. You can almost forget the tension that lurks behind so many closed doors, until you pass a bench where 2 elders sit whispering, casting furtive glances toward a house down the lane. A crime of passion, they say. Another marital outburst that spilled into the street. In Babylon, jealousy wasn't just messy, it was legally actionable. If someone committed an act of violence or outrage due to romantic betrayal, it didn't simply get dismissed as a lover's quarrel. Babylonian courts had procedures, long ones, for dealing with rage born of intimacy, and they had no patience for drama without evidence. One particularly vivid case, preserved on a clay tablet from Larsa, involves a man named Arad Nana who struck his wife in the marketplace after learning she had visited another man's home. His defense? She dishonored my bed and disrespected the gods. The court, unimpressed by his flair for poetic language, fined him for public violence and instructed the wife to remain under temple protection until cooling of temper is assured. Babylonian anger management, 18th century BCE edition. And this wasn't uncommon. There was actually a cooling off protocol in the legal system. If a couple was involved in a volatile dispute, especially one involving accusations of infidelity, they could be separated temporarily. During this time, each party was questioned individually, and witnesses were called to speak on their behavior before the eruption. Peter Webb notes that the Babylonian system, though harsh in many ways, understood that sexual relationships could stir irrationality. The law wasn't there to punish passion, it was there to contain it. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Not all passion ended with bruises and fines. Sometimes it triggered deeper legal investigations. One infamous case describes a woman named Beltia who accused her lover's wife of attempting to poison her out of jealousy. The wife denied everything, swearing by the lamp and by the temple grain. But the servant girl told a different story, about a suspicious soup and an unsupervised kitchen. The case was escalated to the temple court, where it became a sensational trial. Scholars still argue whether the final ruling was real or ceremonial, because the judgment, according to the tablet, was delivered through a symbolic ritual. The accused wife was given a live fish to hold during her oath. If the fish wriggled free, it was a sign of guilt. It did. She was fined heavily and sent to live with her brother's family for reflection. A quirky Babylonian form of justice? Yes. An early version of community safety planning? Also yes. The law even provided a curious clause for when a jealous spouse destroyed property in anger. One legal record mentions a husband who smashed a pot of sesame oil after accusing his wife of hiding love letters. She sued for damages. The judge, after laughing, probably ruled that the wife be compensated with one new vessel and double the oil, as she had suffered both insult and waste. Eleanor Herman, always one for scandalous detail, writes in Sex with Kings about how royal affairs often sparked equally dramatic reactions. Kings who flew into jealous rages, queens who retaliated with icy precision. Babylon, as it turns out, had already staged the prototypes for all these regal dramas, just with fewer velvet cloaks and more goats. But Babylonian law didn't just focus on damage control, it also tried to prevent repeat offenses. For couples who had a history of domestic passion turned violence, their contracts could be amended. A line might be added stating, should either party lift hand or tool in anger, a third of dowry shall be forfeit. Yes, intimacy insurance. It was a way to discourage future outbursts while reminding both partners that, ultimately, the household was a legal structure, one that, like a good brick wall, should not crack under heat. A fringe example comes from a tablet in Nippur, where a man's repeated jealousy led him to accuse 3 separate men of seducing his wife. The court, growing weary, summoned all parties, including the wife, and conducted a group testimony. None of the men had even visited the home. The wife was vindicated. The husband was ordered to sleep in the outer courtyard for 6 nights and reflect on restraint. Modern translation, the world's earliest recorded couch surf. Historians still debate the extent to which these rulings were enforced. Some scholars argue that wealthy families often bypassed them, settling matters privately with payments and oaths. Others believe these stories reflect an idealized version of the law, an aspiration more than a reflection. But whether strictly followed or not, the message was clear. Babylonian society understood that love, jealousy, and rage were dangerous forces, and that they could tear families, reputations, and social order apart if left unchecked. So here you are now, sitting on that same worn bench where the elders whispered, the night thick around you. Somewhere a woman sings softly as she grinds grain. Somewhere a man whispers an apology he should have said 2 days ago. And in the soft glow of another clay lamp, 2 lovers argue, not loudly, not cruelly, but with the cautious rhythm of people who understand that sometimes what's said in passion can end up on a tablet, and that tablets, unlike feelings, don't forget. You drift farther into the quieter quarters of Babylon now, where the alleys grow narrower and the houses stand closer together, almost conspiratorially. The air smells like lentils and charcoal, and somewhere behind a shuttered window, a reed flute plays an off-key lullaby. This neighborhood isn't known for its palaces or its temples. It's known for its gossip. And tonight's story? It's about gossip that ruins lives, specifically sexual gossip used as legal evidence. Yes, in Babylon, someone whispering about who climbed through whose window wasn't just juicy entertainment. It could be admissible in court. Let's set the scene. You're a moderately respected merchant. One morning you wake to find your name etched onto a small tablet, tacked onto the temple notice board. The accusation? He laid with the wife of Dar Marduk during the festival of spring. No names were supposed to be mentioned. No formal charge had been filed. But here it is, in cuneiform in public. That's not slander. That's potential evidence. In many parts of Babylonian law, sexual misconduct wasn't just between the people involved. It was a communal concern. The city functioned like one very nosy, highly literate neighborhood where your reputation could be litigated just as easily as your tax returns. And if enough people repeated a rumor, it could carry weight in court. Peter Webb explores this dynamic in The Erotic Spirit Through History, noting how legal systems often borrow from the social ecosystem. In Babylon, public perception and legal legitimacy were intertwined. What your neighbors thought of you could sway a judge's verdict more than the contract in your pouch. One recorded case tells of a woman named Etirat, accused of adultery not by her husband, but by the neighboring baker's wife. The baker's wife testified that she had seen Etirat exit a home not her own, smiling with her robe undone. When pressed, she added, also her hair was unusually tousled. The court summoned Etirat, who calmly explained that the home belonged to her cousin, and she had fallen asleep there after helping grind flour. The judge, clearly amused, ruled in her favor, stating that rumors are not bread, they must rise before being served. A proverb and a legal decision all in one. Still, not everyone got off so easily. Another clay tablet details how 3 men were accused of frequenting the home of a certain unmarried woman. No one caught them in the act. But when the woman fell pregnant, the elders used witness accounts, footsteps heard, a sandal left behind, someone spotted leaving with a fig cake as evidence. All 3 men were fined, and the child was assigned to the eldest. Whether he was the father, historians still debate. A fringe custom in some districts even encouraged anonymous reporting. In one part of Babylon, a clay jar sat outside the temple gates. Locals could slip in a sliver of tablet etched with anonymous concerns. If the matter was serious enough, particularly involving sexual misconduct, the temple judges would investigate. Think of it as the world's oldest complaint box, complete with the potential for clay-based lawsuits. And it wasn't only women who bore the brunt of sexual rumors. A particularly bizarre case comes from a scribe named Elisha, who was accused by 3 different women of over-eagerness in the act. Their complaints weren't about impropriety, but enthusiasm. When the court asked for clarification, one woman said, "He speaks poetry too soon." The judges, possibly choking back laughter, ruled that while no crime had been committed, Elisha was advised to temper his verse and limit his visits. Babylonian judges, part magistrate, part marriage counselor. Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings reminds us how, even in royal courts, whispers could become evidence. A poorly timed rumor could start wars, end dynasties, or result in exile. Babylon, it seems, paved the way. Gossip here had structure, weight, consequences. Yet not all rumors led to doom. Some served as shields. In one poetic case, a woman named Tashmatum was accused by her husband of entertaining another man. When questioned, she calmly stated, "Let all who know me speak." 5 of her neighbors came forward, unprompted, and testified to her loyalty, kindness, and routine of sweeping the courtyard each morning with unusual energy. The court dismissed the accusation, and the husband was fined for false claims. As the judge said, "A loud mouth cannot drown clean footprints." Still, it's hard not to feel uneasy about this system. For every story of vindication, there's one of quiet injustice. People whose names vanished from records, women who disappeared after scandal, men whose businesses dried up after a whisper. Historians still debate whether Babylonian courts prioritized truth or social harmony. Did they seek actual guilt, or just enough peace to keep the temple quiet and the barley flowing? What we do know is this: words mattered. A glance, a rumor, a sandal left in the wrong place, they could shape lives. And in a world carved from clay where permanence was literally baked into every decision, gossip was never just talk. So now you sit beside a garden wall, half in shadow, half in moonlight. Somewhere nearby, 2 neighbors are whispering again, softly, rhythmically, the way people always do when love, curiosity, and suspicion mix together. You hear a laugh, a name, a story that may or may not be true. And you remember, secrets had ears, and sometimes styluses. You follow the curve of a narrow street now, its edges softened by drifting petals from a fig tree in full bloom. The houses here are neater, walls painted in gentle hues, doors adorned with charms meant to ward off bad luck and nosy neighbors. This is where the wealthier artisans live, the potters, the scribes, and, if you squint, perhaps a young noble's daughter practicing her lyre by a sunlit window. And just over there, a stable boy pretending not to look. Tonight's tale is about love across boundaries, not war or territory, but class. Because in Babylon, falling in love outside your social rank wasn't just taboo, it could be illegal. The city was structured like its bricks, layered. Noble families, merchants, free workers, and slaves each had different rights, roles, and, most frustratingly, romantic expectations. Marrying or even laying with someone above or below your station could bring shame, scandal, and legal consequences. Let's say you're a silversmith's daughter. Pretty, smart, a good hand at accounts. One day, while crossing the courtyard, you catch eyes with the palace cook's assistant, a young man with cheekbones sharp enough to slice an aubergine. He's clever, sweet, and technically beneath you. If your father finds out, he has two options: scold you and pray the neighbors didn't notice, or march you to the magistrate and accuse the boy of seduction. The latter might sound extreme, but Babylonian law viewed social integrity as a community concern. Unauthorized affection? That's destabilizing. One clay tablet from Sippar details a case where a merchant's son fell for the daughter of a barley porter. Her family approved, his did not. The boy, Enlilbani, defied his father and moved in with her. The father sued his own son for endangering family honor. The elders ruled the couple must separate unless the porter could provide a dowry equal to his daughter's elevated match. The porter, legend has it, sold 2 camels, his home, and part of his beard, long story, to meet the demand. They married. The beard grew back. Still, not all such love stories had happy endings. One fringe record tells of a priest's niece who fell in love with her tutor, a former slave freed just months before. The temple intervened, citing a clause in her family's contract that forbade marriage to any man of prior servitude for 1 generation. The couple was separated and the tutor exiled to a town upriver. The girl was later married to a grain inspector. No word on whether poetry was ever again involved. Peter Webb points out that Babylonian law wasn't strictly about morality, it was about maintaining order. Class distinctions weren't just social, they were economic ecosystems. Mixing them without official blessing could mean inheritance confusion, property disputes, and of course scandal. But Babylon's people weren't robots. They were human, and humans fall in love inconveniently. One rare contract in the British Museum hints at a legal workaround: a man of lower class elevated by marriage to the rank of household steward. Essentially, he was legally adopted by the bride's family before marriage, thus equalizing the union. The contract reads, "Let him be of us, that the match may not shame." Clever, and likely expensive. Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings recounts similar maneuverings in later European courts. Mistresses elevated by titles, illegitimate children legitimized by decree. Babylon? Same script, older costume. Sometimes families simply pretended not to notice. There's a charming poem found etched on a wall in a merchant's house. I walk past you by the fig tree, you look away, I smile, the world is small, south, let no one see us smile again. A love poem? A warning? A moment of soft rebellion? Historians aren't sure, but it lives on. And then there's the story of Shulamit, a brewer's daughter who was said to have fallen for a palace guard. They met at a festival, overheated, overdrunk, and underwatched. He sent her poems scratched on clay pots. She answered by tucking messages into loaves of bread sold to the palace kitchens. When they were caught, the guard claimed innocence. I merely admire her barley. The court didn't laugh. He was fined and reassigned to border patrol. Shulamit, however, faced no punishment. Her father claimed she was too focused on yeast to notice. A subtle defense, but apparently effective. Historians still debate how strictly these social walls were enforced. Some believe urban settings allowed for more flexibility. Others argue rural communities, lacking rigid oversight, were more relaxed. But among elites, the boundaries were patrolled like temple vaults. And yet, like water through cracks, love found ways. Sometimes through loopholes, sometimes through exile, sometimes through scandal, scorn, and once a very elaborate fake cousin story, another night. So here you sit, tucked in the shadow of a fig tree, listening to 2 lovers whisper across a low wall. She asks him if he brought the lamp oil. He says yes, in a poem. You don't hear the words, but you hear her laugh. And for just a moment, Babylon forgets the law, forgets the contracts, forgets the worry, and remembers what it feels like to fall for someone you weren't supposed to. You follow a quiet path now, worn smooth by thousands of feet over thousands of mornings, some hurrying to market, others trudging to temple, and a few vanishing. The kind of path walked by people who say, I'll be right back, and then never are. In Babylon, when someone disappeared, especially a husband, it wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a legal earthquake. Because sex, as always in this city of tablets and tangled law, was tied to property, inheritance, and one's right to remarry. Tonight, you're stepping into the curious world of vanishing spouses and what Babylonian law did about it. Let's say your husband was a merchant. One day, he sets out on a trade journey to Elam with 20 bolts of dyed linen, 2 donkeys, and an optimistic heart. And then, it's no message, no caravan, no gossip, even from the most talkative traders. Weeks become months, months stretch into years, and now you, his wife, are trapped in a legal limbo, still technically married, but effectively alone. What to do? Well, Babylonian law had a protocol. If a man vanished and remained unheard from for a full year, and the family could find no verifiable witnesses of his existence, his wife could petition for legal separation. The clause appears in several contracts. Should he not return within the time of 12 moons, she may take another, and no blame shall fall. However, there's a catch. If he came back after she had remarried, oh dear. The returning husband could sue for property, demand compensation, or, depending on the court's mood, have the second marriage annulled. Or worse, the wife accused of adultery if she didn't file the paperwork correctly. Yes, there was paperwork. Historians still argue whether this policy empowered or punished women. On one hand, it allowed them a path forward after abandonment. On the other, it placed all risk and responsibility squarely on their shoulders. One famous case tells of a woman named Amat Ninsun, whose husband vanished during a temple construction trip. After 14 months, she filed for remarriage, citing the coldness of bed and coin. The court approved. 3 months later, her husband returned, sunburnt, thinner, and apparently having been kidnapped by a rival merchant. The court deliberated, then ruled in favor of her, stating she had followed protocol. The original husband was awarded a goat and a stern warning not to wander unguarded. Not all endings were that tidy. A sadder case, preserved in a broken tablet from Mari, involves a woman whose husband went missing during a flood. She waited 2 years, remarried, and bore a child. Later, when her first husband's belongings washed up on shore along with a stylus etched with his name, his brother sued her for premature abandonment. The court, uncharacteristically lenient, ruled that her second child would not inherit, but she herself could remain married. So what did people do to avoid these legal messes? Well, contracts evolved. Some included disappearance clauses, lengthier waiting periods, precise instructions for reporting, even alternate contacts. One clever merchant included this: should I be gone and not heard for 16 moons, presume me a ghost. Clear, efficient, a little spooky. Fringe detail: some wives left tokens in the temple as proof of their intent to remarry. Small items: bracelets, clay charms, or sealed oaths, left with a priest as spiritual documentation, a divine backup copy, if you will. Peter Webb suggests that these practices were part of a broader attempt to stabilize family units while still honoring emotional realities. People went missing, love withered. But the city had to keep functioning. Children needed fathers. Estates needed heirs. Beds couldn't stay cold forever, not in a society that saw reproduction as civic duty. One rare poetic fragment, possibly recited at a remarriage ceremony, reads, "He who walked far, may he walk in peace. She who stays shall now walk with another." It's tender, wistful, and notably legal. Eleanor Herman reminds us that in royal courts, rumors of death could be as politically charged as the fact itself. Queens whose husbands disappeared often found themselves in power struggles, not just for love, but for land. Babylonian wives weren't seeking thrones, but they were, in their own way, navigating those same dangerous waters. And then there are the cases where the husband wasn't missing at all, just hiding. Yes, some men faked their own disappearances to escape debt, wives, or other inconvenient entanglements. A comical case from Kish recounts a man named Ninurta Idin, who vanished after borrowing too much silver. His wife petitioned for remarriage after a year, only to have him reappear during the ceremony, claiming he'd been lost in reflection. The court, deeply unimpressed, fined him for fraud and allowed the remarriage to proceed. He was last seen leaving town on a borrowed mule, very much alone. So here you sit by a quiet wall near the registry house, listening to the night wind whistle through the reeds. A woman walks past, her fingers brushing a clay plaque, an old wedding vow worn smooth with time. She pauses, looks up at the stars, then keeps walking. And maybe somewhere her husband is doing the same, far away or very close. But either way, Babylon has made room for her to move on. You drift now through a quieter stretch of the city, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of cooling bricks and citron balm, and the only sound is the soft pad of your sandals against the packed earth. Somewhere in the darkness, a cat yowls, probably a lover's quarrel, or perhaps something even more specific. Tonight, you're walking into one of Babylon's more awkward legal corridors, the regulation of sexual behavior under contracts. Specifically, the parts you really didn't want anyone reading out loud in court. Because as open as Babylon was about sex in temples, contracts, and inheritance, there were certain acts, ahem, that carried legal implications, especially if they were seen as unbecoming of a spouse. And yes, some of these clauses were surprisingly detailed. Others were hilariously vague. Let's say you're a married man. You've built a good reputation. You've got a modest home, 2 donkeys, and a wife who tends the barley accounts with terrifying precision. But one evening, you come home with ideas you may or may not have picked up from a traveling bard. Your wife, unimpressed, reports you to the elders under Clause 8 of your marriage contract. He shall not bring shame upon the mat. What does that mean exactly? Historians still argue. Some scholars believe these shame clauses were legal euphemisms, catch-alls for behavior that made a spouse feel humiliated, disrespected, or frankly, grossed out. Peter Webb notes that Babylonian law avoided spelling out specifics in official contracts, but private records and scribal commentaries suggest certain acts were discouraged or outright banned in the context of marriage. For example, there's the infamous kissing the feet clause. A tablet found in Nippur lists the wife's complaint. He demands reverence as though I were his slave. He places my feet upon his shoulder and sings hymns. The elders, perhaps unsure whether to laugh or nod sagely, find the husband domestic ritual without consent. Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings references similar dynamics in royal courts centuries later, where rulers had mistresses for pleasure, wives for duty, and occasionally contractual rules about who could do what, where, and how many times per week. Babylon, apparently, had already anticipated this system, just with fewer satin sheets and more cuneiform. One surviving Babylonian contract includes this spicy line: neither shall demand from the other acts reserved for temple rights. This has led to endless debate among historians. What were those rights? And why did they need to be kept separate from the marital bed? The prevailing theory? Certain rituals, likely involving role play, symbolic gestures, or bodily positions associated with divine offerings, were considered too sacred or too disruptive for household use. Mixing the holy with the domestic was frowned upon, like burning incense in the kitchen while trying to cook lentils. But not all restrictions were religious. Some were based on perceived decency. One contract listed obscene gestures in the courtyard as grounds for social complaint. Another fined a wife for singing the shepherd's song too loudly after sundown. Scholars think that was either a bawdy ballad or a euphemism for vigorous expression. There's even a tablet where a man accused his wife of mocking his excitement in front of servants. Her defense? He makes noises like a goat. The court, perhaps wisely, dismissed the case and advised the couple to seek the advice of a quiet neighbor. Babylonian therapy, folks. Fringe tidbit: a few contracts specify no emulation of actors or wrestlers in private rites. Apparently, someone got a little too into festival performances and brought the choreography home. One judge reportedly warned, the home is not a stage unless both performers agree. Good advice, really. Now, before you start thinking Babylon was puritanical, remember this: these clauses didn't exist to prevent pleasure. They existed to define mutual expectations. In fact, some contracts explicitly encouraged affection. One charming line reads, "He shall delight her with words and touches. She shall not refuse his hand unless in sickness or moonblood." Practical, poetic, slightly invasive. Peter Webb suggests that these contract terms reflected the tension between public order and private autonomy. People wanted passion, but they also wanted predictability. And sometimes, in pursuit of both, they got very creative with clay. So, what happened if someone violated one of these unspoken rules? In most cases, the offended spouse could demand arbitration. The options included formal apology, fines in silver or barley, or, if particularly offended, amendments to the contract. One woman successfully added a clause banning her husband from reciting temple poetry in bed. Her reason? It causes dryness. Another tablet details a husband who insisted on calling his wife Ishtar during intimacy. She found it flattering at first. Then he added costumes, then incense, then a full 12-step invocation. She brought the matter to court under unreasonable temple imitation. The judges agreed he was instructed to save devotion for the sanctuary. Still, not every act caused friction. One overlooked commentary, a kind of scribal side note, reads, "When both delight in the strangeness, no harm is done." A rare flash of progressive wisdom tucked in the margins of law. So here you are, sitting in the shade of a fig tree, chuckling softly as a passing couple bickers about something involving lamps and sandals. You watch them disappear into their home, door swinging closed with a thud and a sigh. And maybe, somewhere inside, they're drawing new boundaries, or breaking old ones. But you, lucky listener, have learned the truth. Babylon was never boring. Not in bed, not in court, and certainly not when someone dared to combine the two. The sun will rise soon, but the city still sleeps. You walk now along a stretch of smooth road near the family shrines, small domed alcoves tucked between homes, each with its flickering lamp, and carefully stacked offerings of dates, barley cakes, and sometimes a small clay figurine. You're in a neighborhood of women, widows mostly. And if there's a whisper here, it's not about love, it's about timing. Because in Babylon, even grief was timed. Tonight's story is about what happened after a spouse died, or was presumed dead, and how long you had to wait before you could legally find someone new. Because nothing ruins a good mourning period like a suitor showing up too early with a basket of figs and a suggestive poem. Let's start with the basics. If a woman's husband died, she didn't automatically become single again. Babylonian law required her to wait a specified period, commonly 1 year, before remarrying. This wasn't just about respect or spiritual cleansing. It was also about certainty of paternity. If a child appeared after the husband's death, the law needed clarity on whose estate they would inherit. Some contracts even spelled it out. She shall not receive another man's hand until the cycle of 12 moons has passed, lest confusion arise among the heirs. Romantic, right? Historians still argue whether the waiting period was enforced across all social classes. Wealthier families had more to lose if inheritance lines got messy. But even in modest households, the rules lingered. There's a tablet from Sippar that describes a widow named Tilu, who was fined 2 goats for accepting bread and wine before the permitted time. Bread and wine, in this case, being a known euphemism for, well, friendly visits. Eleanor Herman describes similar mourning customs among later queens, how royal widows had to perform exaggerated sorrow, complete with veils, public fasts, and long poems. Babylon, as usual, skipped the performance and went straight to the ledger. But it wasn't all rigid. If the widow had no children and her deceased husband had a living brother, the law encouraged something called a levirate marriage, a custom where the brother-in-law stepped in as husband, not out of love necessarily, out of obligation. The children born from that union would legally belong to the deceased brother's lineage. One rare case tells of a widow named Arabatam who declined the levirate marriage, claiming her brother-in-law was fond of drink and careless with goats. She requested to wait out the mourning period and marry a man of her choosing. The court agreed, provided she gave up half her dowry. A tough deal, but one she accepted. Peter Webb sees this as a tension point between ritual obligation and personal agency. Babylon's laws gave you options, but never without cost. And speaking of costs, a woman who remarried too soon could find herself stripped of property, shamed publicly, or, if caught bearing a child, dragged into a paternity dispute that no one wanted to translate. One dramatic example from Nippur involves a widow who remarried within 7 months. When a baby arrived too early, her first husband's cousin sued for inheritance fraud. The court demanded witnesses, birth records, such as they were, and even a midwife's sworn testimony about the firmness of the moon's count. They eventually ruled the child belonged to the first husband, but the second husband had to pay a fine for jumping the lamp. Whatever that means, probably something scandalous. And then there's the flip side. If a man lost his wife, he could remarry almost immediately, but only if he had no small children. If he did, The court might assign a guardian or wet nurse until a new wife was appointed. One surviving case notes a man who remarried after 19 days. His explanation? The house is cold and the child cries. The court grumbled, then allowed it. But the midwife added a clause to the new wife's contract. She shall not be made to lie beside him until the oil burns through 2 weeks. A poetic delay, likely imposed by someone with strong opinions. Fringe detail? Some mourning contracts included symbolic gestures, shaving a lock of hair, fasting for 30 days, or lighting a specific number of temple candles. These weren't legal requirements, but they mattered socially. If you skipped them, your new match might find you emotionally unavailable. And there were exceptions to every rule. War widows, for instance, had slightly shorter mourning windows. One tablet states, in time of battle loss, the widow may wait 3 moons if no issue has passed from her. The language is cold. The math is practical. One surviving letter written by a grieving woman to her dead husband's cousin reads, I light your lamp, I eat your dates, but I cannot sleep beside only your ghost. Let the gods understand what the law forbids. It's aching, real, and legal all at once. So here you are, beneath a low stone archway, the shadows of widow lamps flickering around you. Somewhere nearby, a woman wraps her shawl tighter and places her last cake of incense on the altar. Her husband is gone. Her year is nearly done, and soon perhaps she'll be someone's new bride. Or maybe she'll choose not to be anyone's at all, because in Babylon, even when the law moved forward, the heart sometimes stayed behind. You move slowly now through the narrowest part of the city, where the walls lean inward as if whispering secrets only the clay remembers. Here the gossip goes quiet, voices drop lower, and eyes watch more carefully. Because tonight, we're walking into Babylon's most dangerous zone of all, the courtroom where sex becomes crime. Not just scandal, not just broken promises, actual legal danger. This is where consent, coercion, and accusation intertwine in a web of heartbreak, power, and high-stakes silence. Let's start with the most troubling truth. Babylonian law did recognize sexual assault. It had words for it. It had penalties. But like many ancient codes, it also came tangled in social status, gender, and property. If a man forced himself on a woman, particularly a virgin of marriageable class, he could be executed depending on the circumstances. The Code of Hammurabi states, if a man lies with the daughter of a man in the street, and she cries out, and it is heard, the man shall die. Sounds clear, right? But there's that catch, and she cries out. If no one heard, if no one believed her, if her social status was unclear, things got murky. Historians still argue over how often these laws were enforced. Peter Webb notes that while the code sounds strict, actual case tablets show a great deal of inconsistency. Sometimes victims were believed, other times not so much, especially if the accused was powerful. One gut-wrenching example tells of a servant girl named Elitu, who accused her master's son of assault. Her case made it to court. Witnesses spoke, some siding with her, others with him. The son claimed she invited his company. The elders debated. In the end, the son was fined, but not banished. Elitu was returned to service. Her name vanishes from the records after that. A fringe case from Mari involves a young man punished for assaulting a temple novice. His defense? He believed she was off duty. The court fined him, banned him from all temple grounds, and assigned him to the reed marshes, an exile both literal and symbolic. In Babylon, marshland duty meant shame and mosquitoes. Now here's where it gets even more unsettling. False accusations were also penalized, severely. If a woman or man falsely accused someone of a sexual crime and it could be proven, they faced harsh punishment, often fines, occasionally exile, and in extreme cases, like accusing a priest, death. Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings reminds us that even centuries later, false accusations were tools of political sabotage. In Babylon, they weren't political so much as personal, but the damage was the same. One documented case tells of a widow named Enadam who accused a rival of seducing her betrothed. Under oath, the rival passed the ritual test, a form of early lie detection involving sacred water. Enadam failed. She was fined, shaved, and publicly shamed in the city square. The records say only she wept. But let's not dwell only in darkness. There were legal protections, especially for women of status. Many contracts included sexual safety clauses. One read, he shall not touch her without her sign or word. If he did, fines, exile, and in some cases divorce without dowry loss. And there are victories. One brave case from Babylon's legal archives tells of a woman named Ninsun who accused her husband's cousin of assaulting her in the garden. She gathered 3 witnesses, including a maid and a neighbor boy who'd seen the man enter the house. The court ruled in her favor. The cousin was whipped and banished from the district. Ninsun's contract was updated to permanent legal immunity from all visits by male relatives not named in her original dowry. An early restraining order of sorts. Still, it wasn't always clear-cut. Sometimes the law asked more questions than it answered. A contract might specify that a husband could not take liberties upon her person when drink clouds the mind. But what counted as drink? How much was too much? One judge famously ruled, 3 cups bring warmth, 4 bring forgetfulness, 5 bring court. And what about the quietest victims? Slaves, concubines, foreign girls brought to market? Their protections were minimal. One devastating tablet simply notes, she was taken and no one cried out. The man was fined. The girl's name is not recorded. Peter Webb believes these gaps in the record reflect the painful truth that legal systems often follow power, not ethics. Foucault, too, would point out how sexuality in Babylon was tied not only to desire, but to control, over women, over bodies, over silence. And yet even here, even now, small sparks of resistance shine through. Women who spoke, judges who listened, contracts that grew more specific. One even included this line, she shall be queen in her own chamber, and none may enter without her favor. A single sentence, but revolutionary in a city where clay usually favored men. So you sit now at the edge of a plaza where long ago a court once stood. The bricks are gone, the names have faded, but the silence still lingers. Not oppressive, just thoughtful. The kind of silence that remembers pain, but also courage. A breeze lifts the hem of your tunic, the stars overhead pulse quietly, and you remember, in Babylon, every touch had consequence, every silence carried weight, but every voice, no matter how faint, left its mark. You pass beneath a carved lintel now, one worn smooth by generations of passing feet and anxious hands. The symbol above it, half sun, half sprouting barley, isn't a temple sigil. It marks the entrance to Babylon's inheritance court. Less majestic than the great ziggurat, perhaps, but just as powerful. Because tonight, you're entering the heart of Babylon's social engine, the connection between sex, wombs, and who gets the land. It all starts with a question that may seem simple, but in Babylon carried terrifying weight. Whose child is it? The Babylonian world revolved around continuity, lineage, legacy, the transfer of name, property, trade rights, and family gods from one generation to the next. And that meant one thing above all, confirming that the child growing in your wife's belly was in fact yours. So here's the uncomfortable truth. Sex in Babylon wasn't just about pleasure or ritual. It was legal proof of property transmission. Your bedchamber was your signature line, and your womb, if you were a woman, was the notary. Let's take the case of a man named Lugal Malik, a silversmith whose wife became pregnant after 3 years of barrenness. Instead of celebrating, he panicked. Why? Because just 3 months prior, he'd been away on a silver delivery to Mari. He returned, found his wife glowing, and immediately filed a petition of uncertainty. The court convened. Midwives were summoned. One testified that conception could occur from a single drop left behind. Another stated the husband's absence made paternity unlikely unless she dreamed of him strongly. The judges, displaying both practicality and poetry, ruled that the child would be accepted if the wife agreed to assign him a portion of her own dowry separate from the husband's estate. The baby boy, apparently, went on to become a priest. History, it seems, loves a compromise. Peter Webb points out that Babylonian inheritance law rested on a fragile foundation of biology, myth, and timing. With no access to modern paternity tests, trust had to be negotiated and occasionally bought. This is where wombs became more than organs. They became legal spaces. Marriage contracts often included clauses like, any child born from her womb during this union shall be his. It's a strange sentence to read now, detached, clinical, but it had power. That one line could mean the difference between a child inheriting vineyards or becoming a servant. And what if there was no child? Well, things got more complicated. If a couple remained childless after a certain period, usually 3 to 5 years, they could adopt. But the adopted child had to be recorded in temple records and often had limited inheritance rights unless both spouses agreed in writing. One such agreement reads, "Though not born of her womb, he shall eat at our table and carry our name, unless a true son should come." Poetic. Also terrifyingly conditional. And when it came to multiple children from multiple women, say a wife and a concubine, things got even more tangled. The children of the legal wife usually inherited first, even if younger. But if no sons were born to her, the eldest son from a concubine could inherit, provided the wife acknowledged him. One case tells of a wife who refused. The concubine's son was denied inheritance and instead assigned to the temple as an acolyte. His name? Aban, which means stone. There's a fringe contract where a man tried to legally disown all of his children, claiming none matched his gait or nose. The court dismissed the case. The wife apparently laughed. Eleanor Herman notes how in later centuries, rulers went to absurd lengths to ensure paternity, from sequestering wives for months to employing witnesses during marital duties. Babylon wasn't that extreme, but they did keep careful records. Midwives, neighbors, and even wet nurses were often listed as legal witnesses to birth, especially for noble households. And then there's the quiet tragedy of disputed daughters. In many cases, only sons inherited land. Daughters received trousseaux, furniture, jewelry, sometimes livestock, but rarely land, unless there were no sons, or unless the father wrote a clause granting them full rights. One beautiful tablet records a father bequeathing his entire vineyard to his daughter with the line, "She walks with my voice, let her own the earth I planted." An exception? Absolutely, but a powerful one. And so we arrive at the center of it all. Sex, in Babylon, wasn't just private. It was the origin point for law, property, and eternal names carved in clay. Which brings us back to wombs. Midwives weren't just healers, they were legal witnesses. They testified to birth order, gestation time, and in one unusual case, whether the cry came strong. Their word could decide inheritance cases, resolve disputes, and in one story, create one. A midwife who lied, claiming a concubine's child was born first, was later caught and exiled. She left behind a tablet that reads only, "I served 3 homes and lied in one." Poetic again. And also heartbreaking. So here you sit now, near the cracked step of the inheritance court, where a nervous young man adjusts his tunic and a weary midwife mutters about barley prices and overdue births. Someone's baby just arrived. Someone's estate just shifted. And somewhere in the city, a name has been etched into wet clay, perhaps unjustly, perhaps not. Because in Babylon, sex didn't end in the bedroom. It echoed into fields, into names, into eternity. The city feels different now. Not quieter. Babylon never truly sleeps, but softer, slower, like it's holding its breath just for you. The last lamps flicker in doorways, casting long shadows that stretch across the uneven clay streets like faded handwriting. Somewhere, a reed flute is being played badly. Somewhere else, a dog sniffs at an overturned basket. And you? You're standing at the edge of something. Of history, of memory, of understanding, looking back at everything you've just walked through. Because this story, this long, slow, deeply strange story, has brought you here. To the end of a journey through the most intimate courtrooms of ancient Babylon. And now it's time to reflect. Tonight, you've wandered into bedrooms and tribunals. You've stepped through temple gates and peeked behind reed curtains. You've watched wives argue over blankets, concubines claim property, and midwives debate the moon cycles of pregnancy. You've seen sex turned into law, turned into contract, turned into policy. You've seen love become legislation. What did we learn? We learned that in Babylon, sex wasn't private. It wasn't something hidden behind closed doors or politely ignored. It was a public force, a tool of inheritance, a method of power, a ceremony, a commodity, a sacred rite, and a social negotiation, all wrapped up in reed mats and oil lamps. We learned that who you touched, how you touched them, and when you did it mattered immensely. Not just for your heart, not just for your family, but for your standing in society. Because in Babylon, your sex life could get you land, or goats, or sued, or exiled, or fined in sesame oil. Some might find that horrifying. Others might find it refreshingly honest. But whatever your view, you can't help but admire the consistency. Babylon believed in order. In a world that often seemed chaotic, floods, feasts, unpredictable gods, the people turned to law to tame what couldn't be tamed, even desire. Eleanor Herman in Sex with Kings describes royal courts centuries later where bedroom gossip toppled empires, but Babylon did it first, and with better tablets, and not just for the elite. In Babylon, even the lowest class woman had clauses written for her protection. Even the concubine had a dowry clause. Even the temple worker had a say. Not perfect, not always fair, but written, recorded, remembered. Historians still argue about how many of these laws were actually enforced. Some believe they were idealized guides, how the scribes wanted the world to run. Others think they were lived realities, enforced with all the cold clarity of a stylus pressed into wet clay. But even if only half of it was true, it's enough to astound us. Because no one does specificity like the Babylonians. We're talking about contracts that banned the reciting of poetry during intimacy, clauses about keeping your sandals on, oaths sworn over the bedpost, arguments settled by whether or not a man sang too loudly after intercourse. Try putting that in your prenup. We saw people sued for being too enthusiastic. We watched a woman negotiate a clause allowing her to ban her husband's cousin from ever entering the bedroom again. We met midwives who served as legal witnesses to birth, and temple scribes who kept track of who owed what after a failed engagement that never even reached the kiss. You've watched people navigate love, grief, jealousy, hope, and deeply awkward inspections of bedsheets, all with the same level of legal seriousness that we'd use today for signing a mortgage. And maybe, just maybe, it makes you feel better about your own life. Because if the people of Babylon could survive all that, if they could fall in love with the wrong person, get sued for it, recover and try again, then surely you can too. You can survive heartbreak. You can survive bureaucratic nonsense. You can survive a world that still tries to legislate bodies, feelings, identity, and love. Because Babylon reminds us that none of this is new. Not the awkwardness, not the longing, not the whispered gossip or the mismatched marriages or the quiet thrill of touching someone you know you shouldn't. It's all happened before. In different languages, in different clothes, under different stars, and it was all written down, carved in clay, baked hard, preserved for 3,000 years so you could be here now, listening. And maybe that's the most beautiful part of all, that all these lives, all these complicated, passionate, sometimes ridiculous people were remembered, not because they were kings or warriors, but because they loved and lost and sued and sighed. And now you've walked among them. You've stood beside the wife who waited a year and 1 moon for a husband who never returned. You've watched the concubine whisper her final goodbye to a son she could not claim. You've seen the teenage groom get fined for forgetting the wedding poem, and the widow refused to remarry because no one else knew how to stir the lentils just right. They weren't just laws, they were lives. So now, as you sit under the slow glow of the final temple lamp, you feel it, that deep hum of human connection, that truth that no matter how far we go back, no matter how strange the world may seem, people are still people, messy, loving, hopeful, lonely, writing things down because they're afraid of being forgotten. But you haven't forgotten. You've listened, you've imagined, you've remembered, and now you can rest. Take a deep breath and feel your body soften, like the ancient riverbanks after flood season. You've walked a long road tonight, one paved with reed mats and scented with frankincense, lined with contracts, lovers' oaths, and temple bells still echoing faintly in your ears. Let your mind drift gently now, no longer clinging to the rulings or the rituals, but simply floating, like a barge on the Euphrates under a blanket of stars. Let the words you've heard settle like clay dust in your lungs, not heavy, but grounding, cool, familiar, ancient. If there are still questions whispering in your mind about love, about justice, about who got the goat in the divorce, let them drift away like forgotten letters carried off by the wind. There's no need to hold on. No court is in session now. No judge is waiting for your testimony. You are alone. You are still, and you are safe. Inhale once more, slow, steady, then exhale even slower, like the slow firing of a kiln that has seen generations of stories harden into permanence. And if your dreams tonight take you to stone courtyard, warm bodies lit by flickering oil, or a judge dozing beneath a fig tree, don't resist. You're just revisiting echoes, old loves, older laws. Let them carry you. Let sleep take you. And may your own clay never crack.